Welcome to the DEA Chicago Podcast. I'm Luis Agostini, and joining me today, I'm very privileged to be joined by our Field Intelligence Manager for the DEA Chicago Field Division, Patrick O'Day. Pat, how's it going?
It's going very well, Luis. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. By the time this airs, I think should be after the new year. So we've past few episodes, we spoke with SAC Lions. We spoke with several parents who've lost loved ones to fentanyl poisonings. We spoke with ASAC Gannon from Indianapolis, telling those stories. We took a look at fentanyl education throughout Illinois and Illinois high schools. So we touched a lot of different topics, but I think one unique topic that a lot of folks don't really get exposure to or might seem like a mysterious, clouded topic is intelligence. People have their own ideas about what intelligence is based on whether it's pop culture or media reports or things that they've seen. But really thankful that you're able to join us, just share your background and your experiences and your insights and everything that you've learned over the course of your career in the DEA intelligence field.
Excellent. Thank you. It's my pleasure completely. Thank you.
I guess we'll start off. Just share your background. How did you get started? And I know you do have a unique story even from birth.
That's true.
Even going back there. So we could start there. I guess I know a lot of folks who know you know that story. But yeah, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So my father actually and my mother as well worked for the Foreign Service for the State Department. And as a result of that, we moved around as a family every 2 to 3 years. So we ended up living on 5 different continents. And throughout that process, that was kind of like my first introduction to DEA was I would start to meet some of the DEA employees that were stationed at these posts, particularly like when I was in high school. So that was kind of like my first exposure to DEA. So I knew that they were around and I knew, what the business was and what the type of person that they were looking for that kind of employment. So later on, after college, actually right after college, it was when Kiki Camarena was killed. I happened to be paying attention to the news at the time, and because I knew about DEA, I knew what his job was and what had transpired in that event. It kind of stayed with me in terms of like what was on my radar. So when I was paying attention to the news at the time, I noticed that there were reports about information that DEA wanted about that murder that Mexico was not providing to us. And we kind of knew that there was some information that they weren't giving us, but they just weren't giving it to us. And so after a while, I remember one of the weekends, it was a long weekend, 3-day weekend, it might have been like Memorial Day. The Customs Commissioner at the time, the U.S. Customs Commissioner at the time, actually did 100% inspection of all cargo coming into the country on the southwest border. This ended up resulting in miles-long caravans of produce trucks that were not getting into the United States. And what I learned subsequently was that the Customs Commissioner at the time did that specifically to put pressure on the Mexican government to provide that information to DEA. And I just thought that was absolutely fascinating.
It's incredible.
And following up on that, a short time later, there was a story in the press about a physician in Mexico who was actually attending the torture of Kiki Camarena to try to keep him alive so they could torture him more. We ended up identifying that doctor, and then one day he was found on the southwest border inside the United States, and we arrested him and then prosecuted him. And those two things combined, in my mind, kind of made me think, wow, those are two pretty powerful things that a government agency was willing to do in support of one of their own. And I thought, that's got to be a pretty good place to work if they're willing to do those types of things to protect and to bring justice to one of their own.
It seems like a lot of folks, especially folks that have 30 plus years in, are really inspired by or motivated by what happened by Kiki Camarena's story.
Yes.
That's you often hear when you talk to whether it's like special agent in charge or at that higher SCS level. That seems to be a major motivating factor or the genesis of their own DEA career and journey.
Yes. Yes, and that kind of like buttresses the whole point of, I guess, why I came into this business as well, is because, as I said, my dad and my mom were in the Foreign Service. Many of my aunts and uncles were in various agencies. So it's kind of like a tradition in our family of government service and being mission oriented. So that's another kind of impetus as to why I ended up in DEA.
So what year did you join DEA?
Oh, we're going to go back that far.
You sure are.
All right. 1992. I joined in February of 1992.
All right. And what was your assignment at that time?
All right. At that time, I was assigned to DEA headquarters, and I was an analyst in the strategic domestic unit. So this was a unit that resided at headquarters that was responsible for monitoring all of the traffic of all the drugs domestically within the United States. And of course, there were other units that covered other parts of the world.
So 1992, if I recall correctly, that were hot on the heels of Pablo Escobar.
Yes, that was right at that time. Yeah, it was within the next year or so that he was finally taken down. Yeah, ultimately. Yes.
So assuming at that time it would be correct to say cocaine
Yes.
was the major illicit
That was the primary threat. Yes, that's right.
threat.
Mm-hmm.
So what was that like as far as working in the DEA intelligence field during that time with cocaine as the major threat?
Well, if you compare it to now, it seems to be almost kind of like a simplistic time, right? Because that was the major threat. Now, obviously, we knew that there was heroin and methamphetamine and a variety of drugs. And in fact, shortly after 1992, we started to see methamphetamine explode, particularly across the western part of the United States. But yeah, at that time, cocaine was the primary threat. It was the most widely abused drug, aside from marijuana, of course.
Okay. So now you are the field intelligence manager.
Correct.
For the DEA Chicago division, overseeing the DEA intelligence work over all three of our states that include Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin. So you've been in Chicago for quite a while, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, that's 98.
Yeah. So it's about 26 years.
Yes.
So now that's a whole different story, or even different. The drug threat, the illicit drug threat in Chicago, from the DEA intelligence perspective, back in '98, what was happening back then, and what were some of the intelligence trends or data that you were reviewing?
Okay, sure. So then, as I mentioned, right after '92, we started to see the influx of methamphetamine all across the United States. So between '92 and '98, I started work on analyzing the threat for methamphetamine across the country. So when I arrived in Chicago in 1998, there was actually an already existing group of kind of like an ad hoc group of people from law enforcement and treatment and public policy, health policy fields that would meet every quarter to talk about the drug threat within the city of Chicago. And when I first got to that, my first expectation was, oh, this is going to be about meth, right? Because we're expecting the meth threat to hit Chicago. Well, over the next couple of years, we would start these meetings out and say, hey, does anybody have anything on meth? And it was like, no, and no. Okay, then let's talk about, crack and heroin, which were the two biggest threats in the city of Chicago at the time. So that to me was kind of interesting because the drugs that were supplied at the time were supplied by primarily the Mexican cartels. And so meth was just becoming one of their other huge products that they added to their product line of selling to Chicago. So it was a mystery to me is why didn't meth break into the Chicago market? And the only speculation I can come up with is that the street level sales milieu at the time in Chicago was run completely by street gangs. It is still today, but the way the drugs were sold, on the street, hand to hand, those were run by the gangs. And if you look at the properties of methamphetamine versus crack cocaine or even heroin, you start to see that the product does not lend itself very easily to that milieu of hand-to-hand sales multiple times during the day, right? Typically, methamphetamine is sold in half ounce or gram or half ounce quantities at the retail level, and the sale that you make today, you're not going to replicate probably for another couple of days because the user is going to go off and get high on meth and probably not come back for another day or so. But in the city, which is a very congested area, lots of street traffic, you need to have multiple hand-to-hand purchases to keep your business going, in a sense, right? So crack cocaine is perfect for that. Highly addictive substance. The onset of effects is rather quick, very sharp effects, and then they fall off quickly too. So the user is then compelled to come back and buy more crack. And that kind of repeat hand-to-hand sales transaction is what typified the gang milieu in Chicago. So meth did not fit neatly into that. So our supposition at the time was that the street gangs did not want meth being sold in Chicago because it didn't fit with their pattern, with their standard MOU or method of operation.
Yes. You mentioned hand-to-hand transactions, kind of fast forwarding, obviously still happening. We still have these open air drug markets across the city, but we are seeing more use of social media and mobile for drug distribution and transactions as well, right? Especially
Yes.
fentanyl and synthetic opioids and pills. We are seeing now more social media apps and mobile, whether it's encrypted chat or the secure payment methods that on mobile devices. We're now seeing that use almost semi-replacing, having to go to a seedy area, part of the city, an alley, or having a plug or a connect, right?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, because now you can do it all from your phone. Yeah, you don't need to go to the west side or the south side of Chicago. You don't need to drive along the heroin highway to go get your fix. You can, at this point, you can have it delivered to your doorstep in a sense.
So, speaking of synthetic opioids and fentanyl but now being the number one driver of drug overdose deaths and poisonings, especially for, I believe it's Americans 18 to 45. What was that evolution like, especially for here in the Midwest and Chicago? I think, if I recall correctly, you might have seen people referring to it as a bad batch, like in the mid-2000s, but we really started seeing a sustained product maybe around 2017 or 18 or earlier.
Yeah, maybe a little bit earlier, but I actually like to go back to that initial outbreak of fentanyl, which happened in 2005 and 2006 in that time frame. Because that was a very kind of limited problem at the time. But yes, you're correct. At that time, when clusters of overdoses would happen, they would refer to them as bad batches or something like that. But it wasn't until we actually had forensic chemists analyze the dope that was being sold did we determine that it was not just fentanyl, but it was clandestinely produced fentanyl. It was not the diverted fentanyl that is available at hospitals and pharmacies and things like that. So that was a big tip-off right there. And it just so happened that in that time frame in 2005, the Chicago DEA office was working a Mexican-sourced cocaine organization here in Chicago. And on one of the wiretaps, they kept hearing about this special project that the group was managing down in Mexico. Further investigation revealed that actually was the clandestine lab that was producing the fentanyl that killed so many people here in Chicago and many other cities across the United States too. So that was one laboratory. They estimate that the chemist at the time probably produced between 10 and maybe 50 kilos of fentanyl, which sounds like a lot, but actually for the entire country wasn't a lot at the time. But once that lab, because we ended up passing information about that lab to our Mexican counterparts, who then seized the lab and arrested the chemist and a bunch of other people, because he was working for the cartel as well. But once that seizure happened, when that lab was shut down, the number of overdoses declined precipitously. And then nothing fentanyl-wise happened until 2015, 2016. And that was really kind of like the start of the explosion of fentanyl. But it's also important to note that because it is an opioid, it was actually insinuated into the heroin using market initially. So initially we would see heroin exhibits and then heroin exhibits that had fentanyl in it. And then over time, over the next couple of years, we started to see at the street level that fentanyl basically overtook the heroin. And now we see many, many more exhibits that are actual fentanyl without any heroin whatsoever. So there was it took a couple of years, but it was a relatively quick transition from heroin to fentanyl completely.
And I think a lot of folks, we have folks that are familiar with the journey of how fentanyl ends up in our neighborhood. But I guess if you could speak to that in terms of when we hear about these pharmaceutical companies that are based in China and Southeast Asia, the precursors that get imported by the Mexican drug cartels, and then what happens there. But I guess if you could speak to that just from the intelligence that's been gathered and verified on the trajectory of how fentanyl ends up in our neighborhoods.
Yeah, so in that 2015, 16, 17 timeframe, it was actually kind of interesting because we started to see two paths of traffic emerge. The first one was the kind of like online ordering of very small quantities of fentanyl directly from China. So these were very small exhibits, a very high potency. So there were many instances across the United States of people here ordering up fentanyl over the internet, having it delivered to their house, them trying it and dying immediately because it was so potent. So that was going on at first, but then we started to see that the Mexican cartels got involved with it. And so when they started producing the fentanyl themselves in Mexico, they were producing very large volumes, but very, very low potency exhibits. So we would see kilos of fentanyl coming across the southwest border that were only 10% pure. And in fact, that was basically the average that you would see at the kilo level was 10% pure, right? So we started to speculate what was going on there. Well, if we go back to the 2005 episode, the Mexican cartel was telling the street gang members here in Chicago, hey, this fentanyl that we're sending you, this heroin, in a sense, is very, very potent. So you need to cut it 7 or 8 times, not the 3 or 4 times that you typically do with heroin. Well, the gangs didn't listen, and they just handled that fentanyl just like it was heroin. And that's what contributed to the massive number of overdoses back then. So our speculation is that the cartels, with that history in mind, decided to send the fentanyl across to the United States at that 10% pure potency, because they knew that would allow the street gangs across the United States to continue doing their standard MO without further, in a sense, and I know it sounds odd to say this, but without further endangering their customers. But of course, it was very, very dangerous for their customers.
And you mentioned the cartels. We could put some names behind them. 2 major cartels that are responsible for fentanyl trafficking.
Yes.
CJNG.
Jalisco cartel and Sinaloa cartel. Yes. Yeah, so the Sinaloa cartel actually has been involved with drug trafficking in Chicago for decades. And it wasn't until the last 7 or 8 years that we started to see the Jalisco cartel really come to fruition and come to power. And the reason that those 2 cartels have become so powerful is because they have certain kind of like competitive advantages that the other cartels don't. So, for example, if you're talking about the Gulf cartel or Los Zetas back in the day, they covered areas in Mexico that were not, that they didn't have growing areas for certain drugs, like for the opium poppy or for the marijuana. And they didn't have really good connections with some of the other major drug traffickers in South America, primarily the Colombian cocaine suppliers. So if you look at the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco cartel, they both manage areas that either have lots of growing area for the poppies and marijuana, and or they also exert influence at the areas where there are ports. And that became key because when they started into the fentanyl business, they needed to get large volumes of the precursor chemicals from source countries, which include China and India and some of the other countries that we talked about. So the fact that they had those competitive advantages allowed them to rise to the level that they are today. In addition, of course, to the extreme violence that they perpetuate.
Let's shift now to the intel analyst career field. The DEA.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So I just when someone you think of an intel analyst, somebody that's working intelligence, maybe think of somebody that's really locked off, closed off in a basement, just surrounded by 30, 40 screens, or just never really not seeing the light of day. Headphones on, to wire, but just being exposed to folks like yourself and your team, it's so much more than that. So I guess what are some of the misconceptions about, let's keep it to a DEA intel analyst, about that career field, and things that people might be surprised to hear or to know that what an intel analyst does or is involved in?
Sure. So, you set up a pretty bleak picture of what analysts do, but in all honesty, there is a little bit of that, right? Because when analysts get involved with cases and they start developing information and getting information from a wide variety of resources, it's important to really know that data. And to know that data, you really need to hunker down and review it and make sure that it is accurate. Because, of course, at the end of the day, this data is ultimately going to be putting somebody in jail for a long time. So that's an awesome responsibility that we have. So we have to make sure that we've locked our stuff down tight to make sure it can be produced in court and be accepted as evidence to put somebody away for a long time. So that's an awesome responsibility. But so when I first joined DEA, one of the things that was said to me was that the analyst job is basically the same as an agent's job. Many, many things that the agents do, the analysts also do. But we just don't handle guns. We don't handle the dope. We don't handle money. We don't handle CSs. So those are the things that are the prerogative of the agent. That being said, especially when it comes time to dealing with sources of information, we also can debrief sources of information. So there are many times when an agent is talking to a source, looking for information about a specific drug deal, let's say, the analyst will sit in on that debriefing and ask additional questions of interest to intelligence to identify trend information. So in other words, if the agent asks, hey, can I get 2 kilos of cocaine, right? The analyst will ask, well, what is the price? Has there been a change in price? What is the purity of that cocaine? Where did that cocaine come from? How did it get into the country? How did it get to Chicago? There's a million questions that analysts will ask in addition to that they will then write up in reports of investigation to add to the case file, but also to feed this huge stream of information that comes into DEA about the drug traffic globally, really. And that's one of the other things I think that's really neat about our job is that even though we're working in the middle of the country and we're 1,000 miles away from the border of Mexico, many, many of our cases lead directly into Mexico. As I mentioned, that fentanyl investigation, that was a DEA Chicago case that resulted in the seizure of a lab in Mexico. I think that's very powerful. That you have agents and analysts working together, and chemists, actually, because the chemists were very important in figuring many of this stuff out with that fentanyl case and continue to do so today. That is a very powerful team when you get them together to develop that information. So, yeah, we do CS debriefings. We actually go out with the agents when they do search warrants. So when the scene is secure, the analysts go in, help the agents, search for evidence of the drug crimes that we are alleging.
So how does one even become an intel? I think for the general, member of the public who might be remotely interested, it might seem a bit overwhelming to consider a career in intelligence with the DEA. How does one get started? What are some of the attributes or qualifications or sought after skill sets when reviewing somebody to become into an analyst?
Okay. So if I can kind of give an experience I had with one of the job fairs that I attended a number of years ago at Notre Dame University, it was an intelligence jobs in the federal government job fair. And I was there, so representing DEA, there was FBI, CIA, National Guard, and Secret Service. So we all gave presentations to this crowd of, I don't know, 300 or 400 students in an auditorium. And the representative from CIA went up there, and he was, he had this really cool kind of presentation. It was all, techno music and all kinds of stuff. And he gets up there and he's talking about, well, we're looking for people, with skills, language skills, Farsi, this and that, whatever language. We're looking for these specific things. And I'm thinking to myself, that probably works for them really well, but it doesn't really work for us. Yeah, it's nice to have maybe some of those very, very finite, specific skills, but our remit is very broad. You have to be knowledgeable about a wide variety of things and have skill sets in a wide variety of things to be able to get our job done. So when I got up to do my presentation, and I had a stupid little PowerPoint, and I'm just trying to do the best I can, and what I told the kids was this. I said, I don't care what your degree is in, as long as you can write very well, you can speak in public, and you have a bunch of these characteristics of an analyst that are really key to being able to do our job well. Dogged determination, interest in solving puzzles, tenacity, curiosity, intellectual curiosity, trying to ask those questions, not just why, but, why. Follow-up questions about why, to really flesh out the why that something happened, or why is fentanyl all of a sudden a problem. We need to ask those questions to find out the solutions to those problems. So those are the types of characteristics that we're looking for. We want very determined people that are very inquisitive, hardworking, and like I said, going back to my personal history, somebody that is mission-oriented, somebody who's willing to work for the public good.
Now back to you.
Oh.
One memorable case that you touched that you can speak about.
Okay. Actually, it's not necessarily a case. It's more of a project that we developed. Working with our analysts here, and Chicago Police Department and the FBI, we conducted an assessment of the relationship between the cartels and the Chicago street gangs, because we knew that there was a change afoot, that we were getting intelligence that the relationship between the two had changed somewhat from what it was 20 years ago.
And this was around 2017, right?
Yeah, 16, 17, exactly. So we started to look into this, and we identified some very interesting commonalities. We ended up writing a report about it, an intelligence report. And that intelligence report was so compelling that we ended up starting, once people started to read our report, people in D.C. wanted to know more about it. So we ended up going to D.C. to brief, I don't know how many times, we went there 2 times over a month or so to brief a variety of agencies, CIA, FBI, National Gang Intelligence Center, our own headquarters, multiple times to talk about the things that we found out about this relationship. Ultimately, we were asked to provide the briefing to the National Security Council in the West Wing of the White House. So that to me was very, very satisfying, right? To know that the product that you had put together was so compelling that the Office of the President needed to know about it. And so that was a great experience, too, to be able to go into the West Wing and into the Situation Room. It's like, oh, this is pretty cool. And a little intimidating to get an email from the White House saying, hey, you're invited to this meeting. I'm like, what? But it was a very, very, very good experience. I'm very grateful that I had, a team together that was able to go out there and do that and actually satisfy those requirements.
And that report is still online.
Oh, yes.
Public. It's on DEA.gov. It's a public document that anybody can review and still.
Yes, exactly. So at that time, we were trying, our division anyway, was trying to see, because we felt an obligation that we can produce intel reports all the time, and we produce them in a variety of classifications, right? Very small number of our reports are classified, meaning that they are secret or top secret or something like that, very small proportion. The vast bulk of what we produce is what we call law enforcement sensitive or DEA sensitive, which can't be released to the public, but is really important for sharing information not only within our agency, but with other law enforcement agencies. So when we started writing reports and bulletins, we noticed that if we just redacted a little bit of these intelligence reports that we were producing, the information really could be released to the public. And that to me is a very important thing, because I think the public in Chicago and in our field division, they're taxpayers. They're paying for us to do our job. They need to know what we're finding out. And so we decided to let's redact these things and see if we can't get these published in a completely unclassified format so that every taxpaying citizen of Chicago can read that report if they want, because they need to know what the threat is to their community. And so I was very proud that we were able to get that done and actually post it on the DEA website too.
That was an incredible segue to the next question. We recently published, or at least that we've published. By the time this airs, they'll have been published, but unclassified to the public intel reports on the illegal drug threats in each of our 3 states. So it's 3 separate reports: one for Illinois, one for Indiana, one for Wisconsin.
Yes.
When you and your team developed those and were compiling sources of data and just everything, what stood out the most, or maybe any overarching themes that you kept seeing for our division, and maybe some outliers that maybe there's a specific threat for Illinois that doesn't exist in Indiana, vice versa, or Wisconsin?
Okay, so I think the primary thing is we look at the threat in 2 different ways, and basically 2 different threats. One is the drug threat. What is the primary drug threat to the division or the state? Obviously, fentanyl is number 1. Methamphetamine is number 2. But we also look at the drug trafficking organization as a threat, right? Because these drugs aren't produced here. They are manufactured elsewhere, smuggled into the country, and brought to our city and our states by people. And these are people that are connected by basically the fundamental desire to make money, even though it's illegal activity. The money is the driving factor in all of this, right? So that is the reason why we have the cartel presence in our states, is because they need to manage the money that they think is theirs, right, from the sale of the drugs. So it's in their interest to make sure that there are people in our states that manage the delivery of drugs to our states and the delivery of the proceeds back out to Mexico or Colombia or wherever. Okay, so that's that second part of the threat. So in terms of the fentanyl threat, I think the major thing is, like I described, it has so overwhelmed the heroin threat that we're just not seeing heroin exhibits much at all anymore. But it's kind of like it's that change of thinking where the people on the street many times are asking for heroin, and they either recognize the fact or they don't recognize the fact that they're actually getting fentanyl instead.
Yeah. And now, with shifting drug trends, now we're seeing fentanyl being commingled with non-opioid sedatives, maybe not at the scale as fentanyl with heroin, but we're now seeing xylazine and medetomidine and basically these other, what are animal tranquilizers, animal sedatives. We're now seeing that come up in the drug supply, right?
Yes, that's true. So for things like xylazine, in and of themselves, they are not necessarily going to be sold as a drug by themselves. That is an adulterant to the fentanyl or to the heroin or the cocaine, whatever they're going to cut it with. But that is yes, that's true. It's these other drugs that are being added to the opioids. And that presents different problems for a variety of reasons, specifically for public health folks. first responders, they may be responding to what they believe is a fentanyl overdose, and they may be applying naloxone. But some of these other drugs that are in the system may not allow that naloxone to work as anticipated. So it presents problems with how to treat these patients.
And now we're also seeing a bit more of stronger fentanyl-related substances like carfentanil or even other stronger opioids like nitazines, right?
Yes, that's true. Yeah. And again, part of this comes back to the major shift that we've seen over the past 20 years of the move away from basically organic type drugs like cocaine or heroin to purely synthetic drugs that don't require, huge farms to grow the basic plant that's needed to produce the drug. They can produce these drugs from, barrels of chemicals and do it in a bathtub or whatever. So that change has really kind of exploded this interest in all these other drugs, and that plus the internet. With having these drugs information available on the internet, the recipes are out there. It's immeasurably complicated the drug situation that we see today.
Recently, there was a sliver of good news when CDC shared drug overdose deaths. They're decreasing almost 15% year over year, almost. That's almost right. Then now, before I believe it was last year, where 7 out of 10 pills that the DEA, 7 out of 10 fentanyl pills that the DEA seized and analyzed contained a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl, 2 milligrams. That's gone down to now 5 and 10. Somewhat, it's still it's just insane. It's still talking about nearly 100,000 people dying from drug overdoses and deaths and poisonings and the pills. That is somewhat of an indicator that things may be shifting in the positive direction. But from an intelligence perspective, I think the general public would still advise them, right? Just the same messaging, just not to let our guards down when it comes to taking something or procuring something that did not come from a doctor's prescription or a registered pharmacy, and just this is still a thriving, evolving threat.
Yes, I don't know if I could put it better than the way you just put it, Luis, but yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, you're right. It is a positive change to have the numbers go down, but they are still unacceptably high, way, way, way too high, too many deaths, and it is heartbreaking. And it's funny. It's like we should be happy that the numbers are going down, but they're just still too high, and that just is unacceptable.
We'll end it on this. You've been with the DEA for, I think, going on 33 years. Mm-hmm. What keeps you going? I mean, you still see you every day, and you're just at it. You lead an amazing team throughout all 3 states. But what motivates you?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning, right? It's public service, family, mission oriented. But on top of that, I have just a wonderful job. Like you said, I've got a great team of analysts, great team of agents that are doing outstanding, innovative work, trying to bring these criminals to justice. And these criminals are very, very adept now as well. So it's that challenge. And that is what I enjoy the most is trying to make sure that our team of analysts have the tools that they need, the access that they need, the training that they need to be able to make these cases so that we can bring the biggest and baddest drug traffickers in the world to justice. And that's what we've done, even from here in Chicago. As I mentioned, we're 1,000 miles away from Mexico, yet we had some of the best cases against El Chapo, who eventually got convicted in New York. But a lot of those cases actually were from Chicago. So I take a lot of gratitude in that our team is focused not just about protecting Chicago and the states in our division, but actually the country.
Pat, this was not just for this podcast, for my own side. Whenever I speak to you, it's like I'm just like a little kid, just absorbing all this information. Just it's a pleasure to learn from you, speak with you, and hopefully the folks listening will get a lot of value out of it. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very kind, but thank you. It was my pleasure.
That's it for this edition of the DEA Chicago Podcast. I'd like to thank Pat O'Day for sharing his knowledge and experience and everything he's accumulated over the past 3 decades with us. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. Hope you've learned just as much as I have. And until then, stay tuned and thank you for joining us.